Hi, it's Kirby Summers, and I welcome you to my true crime podcast. Before I get started, I want to thank those of you who take the time to like the podcast, and another thanks to those of you who subscribe. What I want to do today is I am going to share with you a portion of my revisiting the time that Jeffrey Epstein rented the former Iranian embassy. Uh, I'm going to go into some of the details about that. What I uploaded to my Substack yesterday names the person for whom Jeffrey Epstein worked. I am not including that information on this podcast or on any podcast, possibly ever. However, I do finally expose the person for whom Jeffrey Epstein worked. And again, I'm only going to be exposing that through the information that I continue to upload to my Substack. I certainly upload information to my Patreon, and I thank those of you who have joined me there. What I want to make clear is that I share different information on different platforms. Of course, it's going to be, it interlocks because we have been studying what appears to be to the general public, not to most of you who have been following my work for a while, and some of you are indeed researchers on your own, what appear to be separate, let's call them scandals. I prefer to call them crimes, but for the time being, we're going to call them scandals. And they seem to be separate because when mainstream media reports on something, they report about it as being a separate scandal. And then they only report what they're allowed to tell you. Okay, so for example, there are almost, I'll tell you one funny thing before I get started. So I always am in research mode, and I came across an article written by the New York Times dated 1986 talking about the arrest and conviction of, I believe, 14 or 15 people, including so-called drug dealers from Colombia. And then they go on to name the planes that they were using. And of course, they were using Air America planes. And Ed Meese, uh, Ronald Reagan's good friend, who, as I have explained to you when I talk about certain other scandals, was involved with the, I need to be really careful here, but was involved with Vicky Morgan and Bloomingdale and caught on tape. However, he was, well, let's just say he provided a quote for the New York Times about the quote war on crimes, but here we are, we're talking about Air America, which is a CIA owned subsidiary, right? So that the mainstream narrative is never really a true interpretation of what happens in the media. I revisited in the article where I share the name of Epstein's actual boss. He had a boss. Remember, I've always told you that Epstein is not a standalone character. Uh, I do not believe he is alive. Sorry to disappoint you folks, but he, along with many, 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 many other people throughout the years, have had to be silenced. And many of them had accidents, whether in their car or on a plane, or, somehow they found themselves becoming incredibly depressed from one day to the next and committing so-called suicide. But to get to the matter at hand, an article appeared in the New York Daily News, dated December 23rd, 1997, about the Iranian embassy that was rented to Jeffrey Epstein. However, what I want you to know at the outset is that this is the very same newspaper that Robert Maxwell purchased just before he mysteriously drowned and disappeared off his yacht, the Lady Galen, uh, which happened on November 5th, 1991. The next owner is Mort Zuckerman. Now, if you have been following my work, you know that in 2004, Mort Zuckerman, who is referred to as, quote, a media mogul, a billionaire, he invested over $10 million with Jeffrey Epstein in what turned out to be an unsuccessful effort to purchase the so-called gossip magazine Radar. However, he owned the New York Daily News after the unexpected death of Robert Maxwell, and he kept it for over 20 years. In 2017, he sold it for $1. Always be suspicious of these transactions that are $1. And by the way, Zucker, and I'm going to repeat, Zuckerman, if you have been listening to all of my podcasts, if you have been reading my work diligently, then you will know that Zuckerman is someone about whom I know a lot personally, because he was involved with the person that I write about in my memoir, The Billionaire's Woman. And I happen to know that Zuckerman is an asset. I'm not going to even say at this point who he is an asset for, but he is used covertly for covert operations, because literally, again, what we read in the mainstream media narrative is not really what happens in the course of our collective history and before we were born, and what's going to happen after we're not here. So I thought it rather interesting that it was the New York Daily News, owned by Zucker. I mean, just a lot of this stuff is just crazy sometimes. Owned by Insider, I'll just call him Insider, Mort Zuckerman, who is, by the way, a very close friend of David Boies. I don't want to leave that out. In fact, you know what? I'll do a separate episode on the very close relationship between Mort Zuckerman, who was with David Boies, and they rented sort of like a part-time apartment in Paris, and the other members of the Boies Schiller firm on another podcast, because it's only by looking at the relationships of these people and how they marry each other's like wives, one marries this guy's wife, or they marry this guy's daughter, and it's a very incestuous group. And by following these interlocking relationships, that's the only way to really get at the root of what's going on, except that in this case, it has many different tentacles, right? So I'm just going to read to you what was published in, I'm going to call him Mort, in Mort's New York Daily News on December 23rd, 1997. I'm going to include information that I discovered on my own that has never been disclosed before. And I'll share as much as I can, and then I invite you to come on over to my Substack, where you can find out ultimately who Epstein reported to, let's call it that. Okay, so Ivan Fisher and Jeffrey Epstein, the United States government owns East 69th Street, official Iranian residence, seized 1980. This is sort of the title. However, even the title is wrong, because the official Iranian embassy still belongs to the country of Iran. It was seized when the Iranian government was toppled by the Ayatollah Khomeini. However, the property itself still belongs legally to Iran. So even the information that's provided by somebody like Mort's newspaper is incorrect. They're even incorrect about the year that the United States, quote, seized the Iranian embassy. They write about it as being 1980. I happen to know that it was 1979. I live in New York. I know a lot about real estate. But in any event, it says lawyer pays not a cent for palatial East digs. For the last year, high-profile Manhattan attorney Ivan Fisher has been living in the lap of luxury rent-free. And then they have a little area where they have photos of the Iranian embassy, again, that was rented to Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm going to tell you what its purpose was once I read this article to you. It has carved doors, a white marble foyer, 3 kitchens, 3 bedrooms, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookcases, a steam room, 19th century chandeliers, sconces, and a marble central staircase. Okay, so, and then the article begins. For the last year, Fisher has lived a New Yorker's in a New York home in an opulent mansion without paying a fee, and the landlord has been losing out on the rent. And then they point to the landlord as being the taxpayers of New York. Okay, and I'll just interject here and say that the State Department pays for the upkeep of the property, but they don't necessarily own it, nor is the income that the property generates goes into coffers that are, quote, used by the citizens of New York. So it goes on to say that Fisher has lived rent-free in an East 69th Street mansion that used to be an official Iranian residence. It was seized by the feds when the Ayatollah Khomeini took over the U.S. And then, they have a lot of things wrong in this article, but I'm just gonna go plow through it. The house, again, it just repeats. I love it, Fisher said. I pray to God I can stay, but all good things could come to an end. The Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office went to court last week to evict Fisher, saying he owes a year's worth of $15,000 a month rent for his uptown palace, a total of $180,000. Fisher said he offered to pay $15,000 per month, even $20,000, but the feds insisted on duking it out in court. So he sits back and lets justice take its peculiar course. It's erratic, he said of the federal government. They tell me to get back to them immediately, then it takes them months to get back to me. The State Department began renting the building to Jeffrey Epstein, and this is how Mort, our pal Mort, described Epstein at the time. Remember, he knows Epstein. He describes Epstein, who was given second tier in the story, so his name is buried. You wouldn't even know this had much to do about Epstein if you didn't know who Epstein was. So, okay, to continue, it says, by the State Department began renting the building to Jeffrey Epstein, a Palm Beach high-profile. They just get so much of this wrong, so I have to just try to make sense of this because it's intentionally sort of changed its text. The point of it being that the Department of State rented the building to Jeffrey Epstein, who was described as a Palm Beach high-profile. They don't even say what high profile, whatever, but I'm going to fill in the blank and use what they've always used, which is the word financier. And then Ivan Fisher sub-rented it by January of 1996 when Epstein moved out. And instead of it being $15,000 a month, which is what Jeffrey Epstein was being charged for it, he charged 20. I can tell you, as somebody who was born in New York, knows a lot about real estate, that that's a little amount of money. It's minuscule for the rental of a townhouse. And that's what this building is. It's a townhouse. It's not as large as the townhouse that Leslie Wexner would later provide for the use of this operation that Epstein was put in charge of, but it's still a townhouse. So he was paying a minuscule amount of that. And then he charged Ivan Fisher, who's a very colorful character, and you will understand why shortly. So Fisher said that Epstein assured him the State Department had signed off on the deal. In May 1996, Fisher began paying Epstein $20,000, and Epstein made, quote, a tidy $5,000 a month profit that the government didn't know about, and that Fisher moved his family into the upper floors and his law firm into the lower floors. Unfortunately, and I'm reading still from the article, the State Department insists that Epstein did not have permission to sublet, and that, quote, that the State Department was furious about Epstein not leasing but making a profit. I can assure you the State Department was not furious about the fact that Epstein was pocketing $5,000, because that's common practice in New York City and has been long before Jeffrey Epstein came onto the scene. What the State Department was very likely more furious about was that Fisher connects to other covert operations that, of course, the State Department, i.e. CIA, would not want the world to find out about. That was its primary concern. They could care less that Epstein was pocketing $5,000. Okay, so I'm going to then share information that nobody has even put together before. In 1994, Jeffrey Epstein was having issues inside the embassy. And I can tell you now that I believe the former Iranian embassy was provided to Epstein for him to conduct the operation, and it was given to him in February of 1992. This is at the beginning of a separate operation that Jeffrey Epstein was involved with, that included Ghislaine Maxwell, Robert Maxwell's daughter, and that we have all been following very closely since his arrest, primarily since July 2019, while some of us have been following it much longer in history. And of course, the victims have been following it from the time that they were ensnared in this operation that some people, like Alan Dershowitz, continues to deny, and which the media portrays as a one-off. Jeffrey Epstein, so-and-so, and suicide, and blah, 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 so that the public at large really believes, oh, this was a pervert, which he was, but so are every other person that works in the State Department. And somebody, let's say, like J. Edgar Hoover, was only able to ascend, becoming the director of the FBI, because he was a crazy person like Epstein. You need people who have no morals, okay? Because that's what it takes to do the kinds of things that they need to do for, let's call it the cabal that, run our collective governments. So I wrote that Perhaps the strangest real estate transaction I've come across is when the State Department, through the Office of Foreign Missions, rented the former Iranian Embassy located at 34 East 69th Street to Epstein. And then I go on to list what the OFM's role is with regard to an embassy. And then I name the person who rented the space to Epstein. You're not going to necessarily find it even in the lawsuit that the State Department entered into when it decided it needed to evict Ivan Fisher, who was steadfast. He did not want to move. And Jeffrey Epstein, as we know, was protected. The year now is 1996. Let's see, it's 1990. Wait, let me just go back and see the year of the lawsuit. I believe the lawsuit began. The lawsuit commenced to get rid of him in 1998. Hold on, I just want to get these dates right. And I have notes in two different places. So give me a sec. Okay, the lawsuit basically was in 1997. Okay. So Epstein calls and complains to the Department of Buildings in New York that the elevator in the building that has been provided to him to run this covert operation, the former Iranian embassy, that the elevator is not working. And Epstein has a temper. And so what happens in New York City is that the Department of Buildings will send out an inspector. And the inspector, technically, what should happen is they then contact the property owner, also known as the landlord, and then they let them know, hey, this is going on in your building. You need to take care of it, or we're going to issue a fine until you repair it. I'm not going to get into the intricacies of how landlords in New York get over on the Department of Buildings, but I will say that in this particular case, the building, it was not zoned under the jurisdiction of the Department of Buildings in New York because it's an embassy, okay? So that in the records of the Department of Buildings, it says, no, we're not responsible. So in 1994, when Jeffrey Epstein complains about the fact that his elevator is not working, the Department of Buildings says it's not our problem. I think this was the moment. In fact, I'm sure this is a turning point where the government's, and I said plural because we know that there are at least two different agencies involved, decide, you know what, we can't leave Epstein at this premise. Number one, if he continues to make calls, we can't have that because it's not under the jurisdiction of the Department of Buildings. In fact, even though Epstein himself illegally sublet it, the Department of State was the one who initially broke the law, because in New York, buildings are zoned. They're zoned for many different things. Among these are residential use and/or office use. And this particular building, located at 34 East 69th Street, is zoned for office use, meaning that it cannot be rented for residential purposes, which is what the Department of State did when it rented it to Epstein in early 1992. So at that point, of course, so it's 1994, Epstein has provided a first complaint, which reaches the desk of the people from whom the building was provided to him. It is at this point that then the White Knight let's call him the White Knight in this case, Leslie Wexner, another operative. I'm going to use that term for Wexner because I've been working on a very long series, Deconstructing Wexner, on my Substack, and he is an operative, steps in, and that is when Epstein in 1996 moves into the mansion that we now know as Epstein's Manhattan place, located at 9 East 71st Street. So the things that the Department of State did not want to leak out via Fisher is because Fisher has really, I'm going to use the word had, really interesting clients, including mob figures of the most notorious cases in history, the Pizza Connection and the French Connection heroin trials. So most of you might have some knowledge about the Pizza Connection, and possibly more so with the French Connection, because many of you have probably seen the movie The French Connection with Gene Hackman. That's based on one of Fisher's clients. The Pizza Connection was another similar and again overlapping case where there were pizza places, and if you come to New York City, there's like a pizza place almost on every block. Through pizza places, they were funneling cleaning, they were using them as laundromats to launder drug profits, okay? And that is known as the Pizza Connection. But if you dive into this, you'll see that there are intelligence agencies and other entities, such as the Vatican Bank in Rome, Italy, meaning the Vatican, involved. You'll see that there's some Hollywood connections, notably, possibly, I'm not going to mention a lot of names here, but notably the people who made the very well-known Godfather trilogy, that it connects to Gulf and Western, who does have, at least at the time, Paramount, who was in charge of filming Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather at the time. But these are companies that, of course, like Gulf and Western, they own other companies. And these are all interconnected and all intertwined in doing other things that involve the same people that are connected to what we know as the Jeffrey Epstein, I always call it the saga. However, one of the people that Fisher sublet to, because he had sublet letters of his own, was another man um, who also had a minor, when I use minor, I'm saying so like minor girls not of age trafficking ring. And of course, because at one girl in particular by the name of Zahia Dehar, Zahia, last name Dehar, was trafficked by a person that is connected to the Fisher clan, which are interrelated. Again, everything is interconnected. So she refused when she was contacted at the time, but it was discovered that there was yet another trafficking operation, to cooperate. She said that no, she engaged in these entertainment, I'm going to call them, situations with prominent people, and primarily she was prominent people, meaning in the sports industry, okay, that she participated willingly. Well, no one pushed it, right? No one pushed it because, again, you're talking about what is always going to exist. It's the world of trafficking and blackmail, which is how the secrets of the elites are kept secret, and how people are sort of contained within a certain space to do certain things. I tried to include as much as I could. What I also did on the article, and I might even share some of these photos on my Twitter, is I was able to obtain photographs of the interior of the embassy that Epstein was provided, because I think the most the public has seen is an exterior photo, but I was able to get some pictures of the interior, and I'll be posting them possibly on my Twitter. But again, I then include a section where I name the person for whom Epstein worked. I provide receipts. I'll be working on a follow-up to, and it'll make sense to you once you see it in the manner that I explained it. And again, I provide receipts. You will understand how, like, the answer was almost sitting just beneath the surface, right? So almost hiding in plain sight, but kind of not really. You have to do some scraping of a very hard surface to get to who not created Epstein, because he was an asset from years earlier, but who made him work in this specific operation. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to say have a really nice Sunday, and hopefully I'll see you on my Substack. Okay, guys, like the podcast. Thanks. Bye.